Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Matt, welcome back.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here as always.
Matt, we had a really interesting series of articles primarily in the Wall Street Journal, who broke the story about the Bank of America and their workplace culture. You wrote about it in Radical Compliance. You want to set the stage because there's a lot for the compliance officer to digest for this.
There is, in fact, I think probably the saddest part of this is you can't even necessarily say the Wall Street Journal broke this story recently because this has been a problem at Bank of America for at least 10 years when the Wall Street Journal first broke this story, which is that Bank of America's investment banking division, not the retailers, the cashiers and tellers that you might meet at your local Bank of America branch, but the investment banks division, they overwork their junior banker employees so much that not long ago, earlier this spring, one of their junior bankers apparently worked himself to death. Frankly, the man his name was Leo Lucanis. He had been working more than 100 hours a week for at least a month at Bank of America to help close a major acquisition. The deal closed. They went out to some celebratory dinner. And later on that night, Mr. Lucanis, who was 35, he died of what seemed to be a blood clot in his coronary artery. And there's not necessarily a direct connection between his Bank of America work and his heart failure, but certainly working 100 hours a week for weeks on end doesn't help. And that led to this major Wall Street Journal article last week exploring the really sweatshop culture, for lack of a better word, at Bank of America in its investment banking division, where employees, younger employees looking to buck up and make a senior banking partner someday with millions in salary, routinely working 80 to 100 or more hours a week for weeks on end. And there were stories of bankers there who would work themselves into some sort of healthcare crisis or some sort of mental health crisis, who would quit their jobs. But Tom, the worst part of that is, and like I said, this is not news because Bank of America previously was in the news for overwork in 2013 when an intern who was working more than 100 hours a week for weeks on end, he also died. And this was a young man in his 20s over in their London offices, I believe it was, who also had some sort of a heart issue, died at a totally unnatural young age. And again, we can't directly say that Bank of America's work policies led to his death, but Bank of America's work policies did not help. And Bank of America back in 2013 had promised that they were going to implement measures to crack down on the overwork crisis at Bank of America, and policies were adopted, reforms were announced, and then they didn't work. And middle managers just told employees, don't report the hours you're working and continue to work in these white collar sweatshops. And so they did. And so now 10 years later, we have another death from overwork. And here's Bank of America again, promising that it's going to implement reforms. And Tom, what struck me is that this really is just a corporate culture problem. There is a issue, it's well known, and the company says they want to do something about it, and they roll out these measures, and then nothing gets done. And that is a corporate culture dysfunction that I think any compliance officer in any industry would be able to appreciate.
So, Matt, let me unpack a couple of things to start with. You mentioned the 2013 incident as a precursor to 2024. Yet after 2013, as you noted, Bank of America said they would make changes. Part of those changes were any hours above 80 hours a week had to be reported because apparently 80 was the minimum threshold. But we had people working up to 100 hours. And senior management was very loud and very noisy about this 80-hour rule, but somehow there was a disconnected middle management. So let's start off by exploring that disconnect. Did middle management simply not implement what they were told? Did they do workarounds? Were even you noted in your blog posts that you weren't ascribing any nefarious intentions to senior management, at least, but could we look at that at middle management and raise an eyebrow? What's the disconnect?
I think we could. What really struck me was that both back in 2013 and now, when we had these two untimely deaths, senior executives, both at Bank of America and at other Wall Street banks, because they also do this 80 hours a week thing, because I guess 80 is the new 40 if you're in investment banking. Senior executives are saying that we don't want this and we care about the health and well being of our junior bankers. And I do believe them when they say that. I don't think they are talking out of one side of their mouths, but don't really believe it and are saying something else outside the other. I think that they have a sincere concern. And also, clearly, the junior bankers are on the same page because they don't like working 100 hours a week either. I don't know anybody would for any amount of money. They feel like they're compelled to because they have no choice. So we have this sandwich of allegiances where the senior executives and the junior executives are both saying we don't want sweatshop conditions in the white collar investment banking world. But the middle managers are the ones who are short circuiting that. And that's really where I wanted to focus because I think that is the corporate culture dysfunction that could affect any industry in any organization. We have seen plenty of times where senior executives will say this ethical abuse shall not pass. And then, of course, it passes. Why? Because the middle managers who are the gatekeepers here, they are allowing that dysfunction to pass and to endure. And I don't think that's news per se, that middle managers are crucial and they are a linchpin to corporate success or dysfunction. That's been known for quite a while. But I really think it underlines not just the importance of middle managers, but how senior managers talk to middle managers. That's where change does or doesn't take root because senior managers were also talking to the lower level employees and saying all the right things, but those right things didn't turn into right actions and right policies and right culture. So, what were senior executives really telling middle managers? How much were they speaking words that sounded nice, but then did not follow up with more concrete action, such as some sort of policy about if we have sweatshop allegations in your division, Mr. Middle Manager, you will be punished? Did they align the incentive compensation for middle managers to focus on the good ethical conduct? Or did they focus more on financial performance targets, which would lead middle managers to actually think, okay, the nice words they're just words, but I'm still getting paid to deliver on the deal. So I'm still going to make my subordinates work 130 hours a week and then just have them not fill in their overtime hours, which was really the abuse that was happening at Bank of America. They had these policies, like you said, anything over 80 hours a week, an employee had to get permission from HR. So middle managers just turned to the junior officers or junior bankers and said, don't report that to HR. Don't tell them how many hours you're working. Where did they get the idea that was okay? Either senior executives told them it's okay to ignore the rules, which I don't know that happened. That strikes me as particularly egregious and far-fetched. And like I said, I think bankers are greedy, but they're not inherently evil. Or did senior bankers give a lot of nice words about what's important, but they did not follow up with concrete actions that drove middle managers to behave in certain ways? It's not about middle management. It's about how senior management interacts with middle management. And that really is fine point compliance officers need to keep their eye on.
Let me focus on the financial performance targets because a couple of things struck me about that concept in this story. Is the financial performance target the deal? Is the financial performance target literally billing more to the client? Is the financial performance target simply working someone above 80 hours up to 100? Because if the financial performance target is the metric, it's got to be the deal because they're not recording this time over 80 hours. But sh- the quality of your work product drops off so much between that 80 and 100-hour mark.
I mean, I think that's true. Now, to be clear, I am not an investment banker. I've never worked in banking. I don't know all the nuances of how bankers do and don't get paid and how employees make their money. I'm going to assume that they get paid based on the fact that they can close major deals. I think really the problem here is the urgency of the deal. And you have that $2 billion acquisition that you want to have closed for the client this quarter, as opposed to missing that window and they report it next quarter. Like, I can see that there's a sense of urgency there, but really, are we letting that urgency eclipse the well being of the junior bankers working on the deal? Secondly, the journal articles did document a lot of, I guess we could call it a certain crotchetiness from some of these senior bankers that when I was in your role years ago, we had to work 120 hours too. So you're going to have to tough it out and just do this. And I was also drawn to think about comparisons to the medical world, where at a certain point in time, in fact, for many years, interns and residents would have to work 36-hour shifts. And they had to do that because the doctors and attending physicians training them said, I had to work a 36-hour shift when I was in your shoes. It's okay, but as a patient, I wouldn't want to be the one at the 35th hour getting surgery from that resident. And just because it's always been done that way is not a valid excuse. And that's true in medical education. I think it's also true in banking. And really, are we going to have a corporate culture that ignores some of these more practical elements of how people want to live their lives? It's a terrible corporate culture to set. I can't imagine that this helps with things like employee turnover at large banks. And here you go. And that's how you wind up with all of this. Tom, I did want to raise one other issue back to my previous point about senior managers interacting with middle managers. In one of the follow up articles that the Wall Street Journal broke last week, they had the big splashy thing. And a couple of days later, they had a follow up article where a lot of the same junior bankers were saying, my middle managers are now telling us to please report all of the overtime hours we're working because they got a memo from senior executives. Exactly. That is really what I just said earlier, is that what do middle managers do? They do what senior executives tell them to do. And clearly in that short window, senior executives suddenly told them, knock it off, have the junior employees start reporting all of the hours they're working. And now middle managers are doing that. Middle managers just follow orders from senior managers. And therefore, the senior managers really need to think about, what is the full realm of all the stuff I am telling middle managers? And am I telling them the right things? And am I giving them the right tools and the right incentives so that they will implement the corporate culture I want and that my junior employees want? Because like I said, we have that alignment with junior and senior executives, but there's not an alignment between senior and middle management, because middle management are the ones who are suddenly short circuiting all of this. And that's what senior executives need to think about.
Matt, you mentioned internal controls. I'd like to turn to that next. Here we don't, we have visited extensively on this podcast about internal control override. I want to make clear to our listeners that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about completely ignoring your internal controls. And I'm not sure we've seen that happen too often in some of the visits and cases we've talked about. So, why don't you maybe turn to internal controls and what were your thoughts around that issue?
Yeah, that's the other thing that jumped out at me, is that the control failure here was simply middle managers telling junior bankers, don't report your hours. And like, that's the control in the modern age at some of the most sophisticated, largest technology aware organizations on the planet, which large banks are. They had a manual control to log hours for real. Is that, and Tom, it's not internal control override. It's not control failure. It's, as you said, they just ignored the control. Manual controls, they can be ignored. And that is what happened here. This that middle management just said, don't do it. Don't log the hours. Some middle managers did say to their junior employees, yes, please log your hours. Some of them did the right thing, but many more apparently did not, because the internal controls design allowed that opportunity to simply ignore the control. And that's the part I don't get, is that how in this day and age would Bank of America allow that sort of control approach, that design to exist? You could automate a lot of hour logging. How often have we read about, or Tom, you and I maybe even have discussed some of the creepy employee surveillance and monitoring that can be done. I'm not saying I like it, but if you want a keystroke logger or if you want some sort of camera monitoring or just a camera in the junior banker's office to be able to see how many hours are they actually working, that can be done. And it seals up the pitfall of somebody just saying, don't report your hours. You, if there are automated controls to observe the employees, that can't be possible. So why weren't they? Why didn't they go to a more automated control? I also would be curious about were any internal audits ever done about employees and how many hours are they working? And is overwork a phenomena or not? That certainly sounds like something that could be audited. We have no idea if Bank of America's internal audits ever did look at that. I would be wondering, where are the bank's HR team? Because they're the ones who are supposed to be on the receiving end of these calls saying, I want to work 100 hours a week. I need your permission. Did they get no calls? Did they think that was weird? Did they tell somebody we're getting no calls to request overtime? That's strange. We don't know. We have no real visibility into what went on there other than a large number of Bank of America junior bankers telling the Wall Street Journal overwork is still a problem. And then we had this terrible tragedy of one of their investment bankers dying at the age of 35. And all of this was known because they went through it all before in 2013. And it was an enterprise-wide problem. This is not something in one specific branch that they had an overwork problem. The Journal is documenting this in New York, in Tokyo, in London, in other major financial centers where Bank of America operates. This was an enterprise-wide phenomena of overwork of junior bankers for years, and everybody knew about it, and they couldn't get that culture changed.
Now, I'd like to now turn to the issue of, before I get there, let's talk about retribution and how that might relate to whistleblowing. You touched on at the end of your most recent remarks on internal controls that HR wasn't receiving any information. That could be akin to compliance not receiving any whistleblower reports. But the first journal article was very clear. There was retribution if employees went through the proper channels. And there was a site to one employee who had requested and received permission both from his manager and HR to take a vacation, took the vacation, and his retribution was assigned work all Christmas Day the same year. There were several employees who said that they went to HR and immediately their managers, yeah, because HR had called their managers and their managers told them, don't ever do it again. And then there was the largest group that said, I don't want to go to HR because I don't want to be labeled as recalcitrant or a slacker or whatever the term was be. That really leads to this culture issue of not just toxicity, but where you can't actually go internally to the places or persons you're supposed to because you'll be retributed against so strongly and so swiftly.
I mean, when have we ever talked about a big corporate culture dysfunction like this and whistleblower retaliation or retribution was not part of the story? I'm not really sure what else we could add to it because, frankly, I think compliance officers have heard that angle to so many of these stories before. It's not at all surprising. I will just, I think the key issue for compliance officers is to figure out how do we get into the minds of the middle managers who are telling people to ignore the controls, telling them to violate the policy, and telling them to retaliating against them when the employees do try to speak up about concerns. How do we get into the heads of those middle managers to understand their motivations? That is what compliance officers need to do. You would need to think a lot about what is senior management communicating, both directly or indirectly, subliminally. What are they communicating to middle managers about what is important? And frankly, compliance officers would need to have, potentially awkward pointed discussions with senior managers to say that the nice words you're giving are not enough. Here are the other ways you're still telegraphing to middle managers that unethical behavior, sweatshops, cheating, that is still okay if that helps the bank achieve a big deal. That's going to be awkward if you have to bring that up to senior managers, that they have to do more or that they have to change some of their more practical operating objectives or financial compensation plans. If you're going to have to tell them they need to do more than just give the nice words. And Yeah, that's not an easy conversation for compliance professionals to have. But clearly, at Bank of America, it seems like that's the conversation they need to have because something is breaking down between what senior management wants to achieve and what middle management is actually putting into force. And the victims of this all are these junior bankers in their 20s and 30s who are working 100 hours a week for weeks on end, perhaps more. And some of them are suffering terrible consequences for it. And it is a powerful, sobering lesson about the challenges of trying to correct a dysfunctional culture.
I think one of the conversations compliance needs to have is about consequences and consequence management. And that the Bank of America senior management, let's put real consequences in place for the middle managers who violated this policy and continue to violate this policy. If they don't start disciplining up to firing some of these middle managers, nothing will get done. Sort of point one. And point two is also a conversation about what is an internal control and what's a process. And any process requires a second set of eyes to validate, meaning you don't self report, I'm at 81 hours now. You self report, there's 81 hours, but there's a backup which would determine whether one, there wasn't self reporting, or two, there was a reporting failure. So I think there's additional conversations that compliance can have, but I'm not sure compliance can solve this issue. I think only senior management can solve this issue because they have to set a tone that said, here's the rule, and ye shall follow the rule. Shall ye not? Ye shall not work here anymore.
Tom, it's funny because as you were talking about consequence management, I even wanted to shade the wording there a bit to more. It's really consequence imposition. Somebody has to show these middle managers who are pushing the junior bankers to work 100 hours a week that you, middle manager, if you do that, you're going to be fired. You, middle manager, if you instruct them to violate policy and then ignore the internal controls to enforce it, you're going to be fired. Consequence management is more tracking all of this at a larger scale to make sure everything's being done consistently. But first and foremost, it has to be imposed. And you're right. The people who do that, compliance officers don't impose discipline. They just track disciplinary action and try and figure out inconsistencies. It's going to be up to the senior operating people and senior management at Bank of America and other banks or at other large organizations. They're the ones who actually have to impose the consequence, even if it is a painful thing for the company as much as it is for the actual banker getting fired if he or she deserves it. So that's the important thing. And Tom, one other final thought of mine was that I know in the past, you and I have talked about lessons from military strategy, about how that applies to corporate culture and corporate compliance. And one thing that I've thought of a lot is one of the great military strategists to think about this, John Boyd. He often would talk about the role of senior executives or senior officers in the military. And their objective is to set the big, broad objectives for the Army and then to define what the culture of behavior is for that Army, for the soldiers, including a lot of it is just when reinforcing to soldiers, here are the things that we do not do while in pursuit of our objectives. And that's exactly the case here as well in the corporate world. And that's really why John Boyd and his ilk of military strategists, that what they've done is so relevant to the business world, is that senior executives at Bank of America, at Wall Street banks generally, any large organization, your job really is to set the big, broad objectives, define the corporate culture, and above all, define what is not acceptable in corporate culture. And then trust your junior employees, the middle managers overseeing the lower employees, trust them to go forth and achieve the objectives because now they already know what not to do. Everything else they can improvise on the fly. And that's critical in battlefield success. And I think it's just as valid in corporate success. And somehow all of that got mixed up in Bank of America. And now here we are with far too many people paying far too steep of a price.
There's one other direction I'd like to go on this story, and that is around a broader or different look at culture. What does it do? What sort of culture does it set when, as a junior banker or an intern, even, you are told the rules don't matter, the internal controls don't matter. The only thing that matters is what we middle managers say that matters. And we've explored that throughout this podcast, but I've wondered, how does that skew the view of someone who goes up the corporate ladder at Bank of America to literally think it doesn't matter what the rules are. The only thing is the profit or the financial performance or something even more nefarious. It doesn't matter what the goal is. I don't have to follow any rules to do what I want to do. And is that a message that's being communicated to literally the lowest level of employees, or put another way, the newest level of employees, that they're infected by that as they rise up through the ranks?
I don't want to pick on Bank of America too much because I don't know exactly what they're saying, although the evidence here is strongly suggestive of some not good things. But I do wonder if was that an attitude that maybe existed at Bank of America or other large organizations 30 years ago? Probably. And then those junior employees then are now the senior employees of today who are the ones who are setting this terrible tone or is conveying messages that the rules don't matter or controls can be denied and overlooked. And I fear for corporate culture overall because even these junior bankers here, whether they're Bank of America or somewhere else, they're going to wind up working somewhere else. And if you infect junior employees with this very cynical winner take all ends justifies the means attitude, they're going to take that attitude to other organizations. They are eventually going to become middle and senior executives themselves. And that is how these things spread like a virus, these attitudes. And they are terrible. It is a very difficult problem to solve. And that's true within one company. It's true for corporate organizations as a whole. Senior executives have to do a better job at conveying to middle managers in clear terms that they can understand that will drive real consequence if they don't obey. Here's what you must do. And here is what you absolutely cannot do because it's not acceptable. It's not part of the culture. It's not ethical. And I guess that's where senior managers have to keep on hammering if we want to get corporate culture back into a good shape.
But this is a fascinating story. I suspect we'll be looking at it again in hopefully less than 10 years.